Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Today we are going to talk about the history of Anglo-Saxon England, starting from their arrival up until the Battle of Hastings. So, the Britain, our Anglo-Saxons arrived at, was a chaotic place. It was in a bad shape. The island had been under Roman control for more than 3 centuries, but that changed when in 407 the last Roman legion in the island left to defend Gaul, and then 3 years later the Roman emperor officially abandoned the island. And the island, which was already under constant pressure from the raiding Picts, Scots, Saxons, and Frisians, was now in a worse shape. So King Vortigern, the king of Britons, requested help from Rome, which was refused because Rome at the time had their hands full with Attila the Hun. So Vortigern was forced to look for help elsewhere, and that help would come in the form of 2 brothers, Hengist and Horsa. Hengist and Horsa arrived as mercenaries in 449, and at first they successfully defended their host. They defeated the raiding Picts and sent them away. But then they realized that now that there were no more Picts, there was basically nothing holding them from taking the whole island, and that's exactly what they did. They found an excuse to rebel, and then they established their own kingdom, which is Celt. And following the establishment of Kent, more people started arriving, and the main tribes which arrived around this time were Angles, Jutes, and Saxons. And apart from Hengist and Horsa, there were other legendary figures who came, such as Ella, who was the forefather of East Saxons, and Theodic and Ida. Now, before we go on, you should know that this, what I just told you, is the official narrative. However, that probably isn't true, but that's topic of another video. So we will just assume that this is the sole truth. Anyways, following the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, there were kingdoms established by these people. And as you can see on the map on the left, there were quite a lot of them. However, this era is usually named as Heptarchy, the rule of 7, because only the 7 of these kingdoms were important of significance, and the other smaller ones were later integrated into the bigger ones. So the first important guy in our history is Ethelbert of Kent. Ethelbert is important because he was the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to convert to Christianity, and the most probable cause behind that is that he had a Frankish wife, Bertha, and she probably convinced him to convert. So another important thing about Ethelbert is that he established a written law code, and this is the earliest Germanic law code, so it's pretty cool, I guess. And he was also the first one to mint coins since the Romans left. And Ethelbert, generally speaking, was the strongest king in the island, at least among the Anglo-Saxons, and he dominated the surrounding area. And once he died, his son wasn't nearly as successful, so another guy will take his position and become the hegemon of the Anglo-Saxons, and that guy was Radbot of East Anglia. Radbot also had good relations with Franks. He had also converted to Christianity under the influence of Ethelbert, though he wasn't as good of a convert, so he wasn't a good Christian, but he was a Christian nonetheless. And he is the probable occupant of Southern Hoo ship burial. If you don't know what that is, that's basically an archaeological find that has been found first in the year 1939 near the coast of East Anglia. They found a ship in a pretty good condition, and there are quite a lot of artifacts in it. One of those is this helmet, which probably belonged to Radbot. Anyways, Radbot was pretty strong, so when one of the kings of the Northern Angles came to him because his throne had been seized by his rival, he marched on the king of Northumbria, Ethelfrid, defeated him, and then installed his ally Edwin on the Northumbrian throne. And then when Radbot died, for the remainder of the 7th century, the 2 key players for power in the region were the kingdoms of Northumbria and Mercia. So the struggle between the 2 of them was usually focused on the control of Lindsey, and Northumbria was the first one to convert to Christianity out of these two, but Mercia followed soon after. And in the end, Northumbrians proved superior, at least for this century, and they conquered Lindsey when in 674 Wulfhere, king of Mercia, marched on Northumbria, so he was the aggressor, but he was defeated by the Northumbrian king, Ecgfrith, and then 5 years later, Ecgfrith defeated Wulfhere's successor as well, so he had control of this. And after these defeats, Mercia was in a bad situation. They were not as strong as before. Ecgfrith, on the other hand, was doing quite good for himself, and Northumbria was on the rise. However, that will change because in 685, Ecgfrith, when he was trying to suppress a revolt of the Picts, died in an ambush. And during that power vacuum that has been left behind those two kingdoms, another power rose, and that was the Kingdom of Wessex, or West Saxons. Now, Kingdom of Wessex, I just said Kingdom of Wessex, but West Saxons most likely had more than one king. They were ruled by a lot of petty kings. However, there was this guy, Cadwalla, who was at first a prince in exile, but then came and united the realm of West Saxons. And he did quite good for himself. He subjugated Kent, he sold his brother there as king, and then subjugated Sussex as well. However, Cadwalla, just after 3 years of being a king, suddenly abdicated the throne, which must have been a shock to go to Rome to get baptized. So he was pagan up until this point. But considering that he died just 10 days after his baptism, you can see the reason behind the decision. He was probably ill. So anyways, following the abdication of Cadwalla, his brother Ine succeeded him, and there was a local king who came to power in Kent as well. And at this time, all of the kingdoms, all of the key players were quite weak. They were weakened by just conflicts. And so this was a period of peace that happened between 688 to 716. So at this time, kings of Wessex and Kent established new law codes, and there probably was a cooperation between them. Meanwhile, Mercians were busy integrating the Vike, which was a tribe to the south of Mercia, and Northumbria was recovering from their losses, and generally speaking, around this time, kingdoms consolidated. And this quarter of century of peace would be broken by the Mercians in 716 when Celred attacked the West Saxons. And following that, we have a century, what we call the Mercian supremacy. So during the century, Mercia dominated basically everything south of Humber. They had great, strong kings, and the most famous one being King Offa, who you might have heard of if you are interested in Anglo-Saxon history. Offa was the strongest of Anglo-Saxon kings up until this point, and he was actually he taught himself equal of Charlemagne, the emperor of Romans or Franks, depending on however you look at it. The century of Mercian supremacy came to an end when Ecgbert, king of Wessex, attacked the Mercians and defeated them in the Battle of Allenton. And then he became the dominant figure in the south. But unluckily for Wessex, they wouldn't have an age similar to that of Mercian supremacy, because it was around this time the Vikings really got their activity. So the Viking Age begins. Now, the first recorded Viking raid was at Portland in 789 when heathen men killed the Shire Reeve. So what happened was basically there were Vikings who disguised themselves as traders, and when the local reeve came to demand identification because these guys seemed and smelled fishy, they just killed him and raided the port. But the real shock happened when in the year 793 the holy island of Lindisfarne, or rather the monastery of Lindisfarne, was sacked. So Lindisfarne is an island, it's a small isle rather, off the coast of Bamber, one of the most important cities in Northumbria. And Lindisfarne was the base of Anglo-Saxon Christianity. So when it was raided and burned to the ground, its treasure stolen and its monks killed by heathen men, it was quite a shock. And all of Europe, but especially the Anglo-Saxons, were quite upset about it. And following that, there were more and more raids being carried out, especially targeting the monasteries. So you might be asking, well, what happened? Where did the Vikings come from? So the Vikings, as you know, come from Scandinavia. But why did they come, at the time when they did? Well, we don't know for sure, but one of the probable causes is that they had advancements in seafaring, so they developed the means and the technology to be able to take on long voyages, long enough to get to Britain. Another possible reason is population growth in Scandinavia, and another and perhaps more interesting reason is that it might have started as a reaction against Charlemagne's campaigns against Germanic pagans. So, Charlemagne, he was the first Holy Roman Emperor. Well, Charlemagne was a Christian and he believed in false religion. So he ran a campaign against the pagans, especially the Saxons, where he would, attack them and forcibly convert them. And at around, this time during one of these battles, he destroyed an important tree named Irminsul, which was central to Germanic paganism because it resembled the Yggdrasil, the tree of life, and it was cut down on the orders of Charlemagne. So there are some who claim that the Viking raids at first might have started as a reaction to the Christian expansion into Saxony, which may or may not be true. Perhaps we will talk about it in more detail in another video. So the Viking activity at first had been in the form of raids, but that all changed when in 685 a huge army came to Britain, and this time they weren't here to raid, they were here to conquer. And they were led by three main leaders, Halfdan, Ivar the Bones, and Abba. And these are claimed to be the sons of the legendary figure Ragnar Lothbrok, who you've all seen on the TV show Vikings. He probably didn't exist in reality, but that doesn't really matter. It's just a cool detail. Now, not all of this army came from Scandinavia because Dublin had already been conquered some 30 years ago. So some of the army came from Ireland, but I don't know why I mentioned that. It doesn't really matter. Anyways, so they came and landed in East Anglia, and the king of East Anglia, Edmund, perhaps cowardly, perhaps wisely, offered them to, supply them with horses and provisions and let them stay in his country, not that he had a choice, in exchange for peace. And the Vikings agreed. And then after wintering there, they attacked Northumbria, and Northumbria fell in 867. And at the same year, they also subjugated Mercia, and they conquered the eastern parts of Mercia. So these parts were already, were independent, but they still paid tribute to be independent. And then 2 years later, they came back to East Anglia, betrayed Edmund, who had helped them at first, killed him, and conquered the country for themselves. Now that all the other kingdoms were conquered, Wessex was the last kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons, and the Great Heathen Army marched on Wessex in the next year. And during that year, there were 5 consecutive battles fought. Some of them were won by Wessex, others were won by Vikings, and in the end, King Ethelred, the king of Wessex, died in April. And then Alfred, the new king and the old king's brother, lost a battle against the Vikings at Wilton in May. And then, realizing that there was no hope of victory, he decided to pay off the Vikings. He bought peace and time. But the Great Heathen Army would be back, but this time in a different form. So What I failed to mention earlier is that Ivar the Boldness disappears from English history after the conquest of East Anglia, so he wasn't present when the Great Heathen Army marched on Wessex. We're not sure where he went. He might have died or simply returned to Ireland for whatever reason. Maybe they needed him there. Maybe he was tired of war. Anyways, following Ivar's disappearance, Halfdan and Buxek were the new leaders. Buxek died during the battles with Wessex, and then Halfdan decided to go north. So that left Guthrum and Abba as the leaders against Wessex. And in 876, Guthrum decided to attack again. So he occupied Wareham, but then he was besieged and he agreed to peace. So Alfred probably paid him off again. But then Guthrum broke the peace and this time occupied Exeter. Once again he was besieged and then he again agreed to peace and this time kept his promise. So Alfred might have paid him off twice, or he might have just threatened him. We're not sure. It's not clear why he didn't attack, but strategy worked, at least for the time being, because 2 years later, Guthrum would again attack, and this time he would be successful. So he launched a surprise attack. Alfred's forces were surprised, and he was defeated, and he narrowly escaped death, and most of Wessex was occupied by the Vikings. So Alfred then ran off to Somerset, to the swamps, and he had a fort built there, and for a while he was the king of the swamps. The situation seemed bleak, and Alfred must have thought about taking a ship to Francia to leave it all behind. Especially when another army under the leadership of Abba landed in nearby. But against the odds, Alfred would fight. So first, Oda the Elderman defeated Abba's army, and this was a relief. Then Alfred rallied his loyal vassals for one decisive battle, the Battle of Attendon, and he actually won. The fleeing Viking force was then besieged again in another settlement by Alfred, and in the end they agreed to peace. So Guthrum agreed to baptism and took the name Athelstan and became a Christian. And the two men partitioned the island between themselves. So the Vikings were already holding on to Northumbria, or rather southern parts of Northumbria and East Anglia. The real disputed place was Mercia. And what they did was basically divide Mercia into two. So the western part was given to Alfred, and the eastern part was given to Guthrum. Following the agreement, Wessex enjoyed a period of peace, and during this time Alfred consolidated his position. So ever since Mercia's last king, Ceolwulf II, died, no king was crowned in Mercia. And Alfred made sure no one would be crowned as King of Mercia. Instead, he found a local ealdorman and married his daughter to him, whose name was Ethelred. And Ethelred ruled as the Lord of the Mercians under Alfred. So he was the Lord, not the king. And therefore, Mercia was subjugated by Alfred. And so he controlled Mercia. And then in 886, he took control of London. And from that point on, Alfred started styling himself as the king of the Anglo-Saxons rather than the king of the West Saxons, which was quite a deal. And it was true because he was the only Anglo-Saxon king left, so might as well call himself that. But that had one of the biggest achievements of Alfred was the Burghelhidich. So this was a system of fortified towns and forts called the burhs, connected to defend the country. Burhs were self-sufficient, manned and maintained by nearby subjects, and the aim of Alfred with this system was that everybody would live within a day's march to a burh, and therefore if there was an invading or raiding force that was nearby, the people living in the countryside could then run away with their valuables to the nearby burh and then defend themselves. So this was a pretty good system, which wasn't really costly because, as we've established, they were self-sufficient, maintained, and paid by the nearby people who were living there. So you can see here, this is an Iron Age hill fort, and there were quite a few of those in England. And if you circle it with a wooden palisade wall, you now have a burh. It is more complicated than that, but again, it's out of the scope for this video. So apart from the burh Hidditch, Alfred also made other reforms. He established a new law code, and he especially focused on promoting learning, and he promoted the English language and identity. We're going to talk about Alfred in more detail, but you should know that he's a pretty good guy, and he's one of the, if not the most important English king. So during the rest of Alfred's reign, there was still Viking raids here and there, and there was another big Viking attack in the early 890s, but those were all repelled, and the kingdom was pretty stable. But once Alfred died, things will change again. So he was succeeded by his son Edward the Elder, but there was another guy who expected to get the throne, Ethelwald, Alfred's nephew. Ethelwald went to the Danes and he gained their support, and he was actually crowned king in Jorvik, which is the Danish name for York. So this image here that you can see is a coin which was minted in Ethelwald's name in Jorvik. Anyways, the Danes launched a naval invasion into Essex with Ethelwald, and at the same time East Anglian Danes attacked Mercia. By this time Guthrum was dead, so it was another guy. But Edward refused to join battle, so he didn't want to fight a pitched battle, and instead he raided deep into East Anglia to retaliate. Meanwhile, a battle was fought between a Kentish army and the Danes, the army of Ethelwald. Danes won the battle. However, Ethelwald was killed in the action, so the rebellion ended because they didn't have a king anymore. And by 909, Edward was in a position to launch attacks into Danish territory. Danes retaliated the next year, but combined forces of Wessex and Mercia won the Battle of Tettenhall. 2 years after the Battle of Tettenhall, Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians, died, and Ethelfled started ruling in her own right as the Lady of the Mercians. Now, there's evidence that suggests Ethelred was a sickly man, and Ethelfled might have already been ruling in his name for quite a few years, and now she will do it solo. So Edward and Ethelfled, the siblings, conquered the 5 boroughs of Danelaw, which you can see on the map, and they expanded their influence mainly by building burhs. So what they did was they would build a new burh and then build one a bit further ahead, and thus establish their influence, because the Vikings didn't have these technologies, so they were really left helpless against burhs. Anyhow, Ethelfled died in the year 918, and for a short period of time she was succeeded by her daughter, but Edward came and basically took the throne forcibly and united the kingdom. So now Edward was in control of all the lands south of Humber, including East Anglia. Now, when Edward died, 6 years after his sister, his son Aethelstan was crowned king in Mercia. His other son, Aethelstan's half-brother Alfred, was crowned king in Wessex. Alfred, perhaps suspiciously, died just 3 weeks later, but Aethelstan wasn't actually crowned as king of Wessex until a year later. When he finally was crowned, Aethelstan became the first king of a united England. And, sorry, not then. It will happen a bit further. Anyways, Aethelstan, after being king of Mercia and Wessex, decided that it wasn't enough and he needed Northumbria. So he marched on Jorvik and conquered it in the year 927. He then invaded Scotland, pillaged and burned, and forced the king of Scotland, Constantine II, to submit to him. He also subjugated the Welsh and the Cumberland as well. Cumberland is here, the one in pink. So, generally speaking, Aethelstan was the strongest king in the whole island, and he was doing quite well for himself. He was a pretty dominant guy. But this, of course, upset the other kings. Now, this is a line from a book I've read about the Battle of Brunanburh, and it goes, "Nobody could stand against Athelstan alone. Together, perhaps they could." So what happened next is the King of Dyflin, the King of Isle of Man, the King of Scotland, the King of Cumberland, and a few others all joined forces to attack England. And they did, and failed. Athelstan won the Battle of Brunanburh, and thus he cemented his control over Northumbria and became the king of a united England. Just 2 years after his glorious victory, Athelstan died without an heir. So he was succeeded by his brother Edmund I. And when Athelstan died, the king of Dublin, who led the coalition in the Battle of Brunanburh, came and took the throne in Jorvik, and Edmund couldn't do anything against him. He then went on to capture the 5 boroughs of Danelaw, and Edmund again couldn't do anything against it. It was only when the King of York died, Edmund was able to retake the lands in the north. And then once Edmund died, he was succeeded by his brother Eadred in 946. Eadred also lost the north and then recovered it towards the end of his reign. So what this tells us is that although Athelstan won a great victory, the situation was still precarious. The English hold over Northumbria wasn't really that firm. Anyways, when Eadred died, he was succeeded by his son Eadwig. So Eadwig became king in 955, but just 2 years later, the kingdom was divided, and his brother Edgar became king in Mercia. Now, the reason for this division is not clear. Some historians attribute it to Edwig's incompetency, while others argue that it was just a joint kingship, nothing that was foreign to Anglo-Saxons. Edwig is still, even though it was a joint kingship, seems to have been the dominant king in this relationship. But then when Edwig died in the year 959, Edgar reigned alone up until the year 975, and his reign was pretty stable. There were a few raids here and there, but generally speaking, it was a good time to live in the Anglo-Saxon England. And Edgar was actually called Edgar the Peaceful, so you get the idea. When Edgar died, he was succeeded by his son, Edward the Martyr, who was, as you can guess from his name, murdered. Now, we don't know who murdered him. It certainly wasn't the fella here with the big sword, because Ethelred was quite young when his brother died. It was probably the powers who controlled him. Because Ethelred was a child king, he didn't really have a say in things. So this was a time of chaos and weakness as several factions tried to influence and advise the king to, further their own interests. And the epithet, the unready, actually means ill-advised. So you get the idea. Anyways, during this time, Viking attacks became more frequent and then they intensified. And the English were often forced to pay tribute to buy peace and get rid of them. Now, this probably is the reason behind Ethelred's next decision, which was the ordering of a mass massacre of the Danes living in England, which is called St. Brice's Day Massacre in 1002. And what this did was cause even more backlash, and the Viking attacks became even more frequent. And in the year 1011, Vikings seized Canterbury, and the Archbishop was captured. There was an effort to ransom him, but during the negotiations, he was murdered by drunken Vikings. So, to understand how important this is, Archbishop of Canterbury was the top Christian in the island, and you could make an argument that he was almost as important as the King of England, if not more important. Certainly, it would be more important than Ethelred, at least for me. Anyways, just 2 years later, that embarrassment, Svein Forkbeard, king of Denmark and Norway, invaded with a large fleet and conquered the kingdom, becoming king. A year later, Svein died, and Ethelred returned from exile. That returned from exile. He was in exile in Normandy during Spain's kingship. So when Ethelred returned from his exile, he was petty and as unready as ever. He went on to execute some nobles who had supported Svein when he first invaded, probably because they didn't have any other choice. But Ethelred took it way too personal and executed those guys, and those guys happened to be friends of his son, Edmund the Ironside. So Edmund then raised his own army, and although it wasn't a full-blown civil war, there were quite a lot of problems between the two, and there was tension. But then something distracted them both, which is the invasion of Knut. So Knut was the king of Svein Forkbeard, not the king. What am I talking? Knut was the son of Svein Forkbeard, and at first he had been elected king instead of his father. But then, when Ethelred came back, he had ousted him from York. So Knut gathered a large fleet and came back a year later. And at first, Edmund and Ethelred tried to set aside their differences and cooperate, but the lack of trust was so much that they really couldn't. And so Edmund tried to mount a defense alone, but failed in the end. And after some fighting, Knut and Edmund made peace. So the agreement was that Edmund would rule in Wessex, and Knut would rule the rest of England. Pretty similar to the agreement between Alfred and Guthrum. However, Edmund died just a few months later, and because there was no guy who was strong enough to, take his place, Knut became the sole ruler of the country. So there was about 30 years of Danish rule from their three Danish kings, Knut the Great, and then his son Harald Harefoot, and then his other son Harthacnut. And during this time, Viking attacks ceased, and the country was generally stabilized. There was a failed attempt to reconquer by Ethelred's sons, but it was unsuccessful, and you could even say that it was miserable. Anyways, when the last Danish king of England, Harthacnut, died, Edward the Confessor, a descendant of Alfred and thus a member of House of Wessex, became king. And this was no invasion, it was a peaceful transition of power. And it happened because when Knut arrived, he married Ethelred's widow and thus became Edward's stepfather. And Harthacnut was probably ill and he had no heir, so he invited Edward to the court in the year 1041. And it's actually funny because just 5 years ago, Edward had been one of the two brothers who tried to invade and retake the throne. Now he was heir, and then when Harthacnut died, he became the king. So, although Edward wasn't necessarily a weak or incompetent king like his father, by this point, after decades of Danish rule, the earls were much more stronger, the country was more decentralized, and loyalty to the House of Wessex was at a lowest point after decades of Danish rule. But the real mistake of Edward was dying without an heir. So when Edward died without an heir, this led to a succession crisis. So there were three men who claimed the throne. Let's look at their claims. So William, the Duke of Normandy, claimed that the throne was promised to him by Edward in the year 1051. This is told by the Norman sources, so it's likely just a justification, though it might also be true. Edward had a falling out with his most powerful earls, the Godwins, of whom Harold was one, and Edward actually exiled them in that year. But they returned with an army the next year and were reconciled because the king had no other choice. So Edward might have promised the throne to William during this period, perhaps hoping to secure help against Godwins, and if he did, it didn't work out for him. Then there's the other claimant, Harold Hardrada, and his claim was that Harthacnut, the last Danish king of the island, had promised to leave his throne to Magnus the Good, Harald's father, but it's not clear if he meant only the Danish throne or the English one as well. Uh, Harald certainly claimed that the English throne was also involved. Anyways, during the reign of Edward, an invasion by Magnus was expected and pretty feared. However, it didn't happen because Magnus' position in Norway wasn't safe. He had his hands full. But now his son will try for himself. And then lastly, the man who actually was crowned king, Harold Godwinson, claimed that Edward chose him as heir on his deathbed. So this might be a fabrication because Harold and Edward weren't, best fellows. Edward probably hated Harold, but Harold was the strongest man on the island and the only Anglo-Saxon. Therefore, you could say, might made right. Also, one extra detail: Harold's brother Tostig Godwinson was actually with Harald Hardrada because he had a falling out with his brother. Anyhow, let's look at what happened next. After being crowned king, Harold Godwinson prepared his army and started waiting for the Norman invasion in the south. However, William's landing was delayed because of bad weather, and then Harold learned that Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, landed in the north, and he had actually already defeated an English army led by the Earl of Mercia and had summited York. So Godwinson then pulled off quite an impressive feat, and he marched his army 300 kilometers north in just 4 days, which is just excellent. And the Norwegians weren't expecting that. They were taken by surprise, but even then they fought quite hard. And in the end, after a bloody fight, the Anglo-Saxons were victorious, and the Norwegian king was killed, and his army was routed. So then Godwinson made peace with the remainder of the Norwegians on the condition that they never return to England, and they agreed. And then just 3 days after his victory, Harold learned that William had landed in the south. So William landed in Sussex and then made a fortified camp at Hastings and started raiding the countryside. And when Harold learned this, he decided to force march again to south and surprise the Normans, just like he surprised the Norwegians. However, the Normans were wiser, and their scouts actually discovered the English army coming. So there was a pitched battle in which Harold's forces took a slope and they defended it with a shield wall. And they were quite successful at first, perhaps too successful, because when the Normans started running back, it's not clear if that was a feint retreat or a real rout, but either way, when the Normans started running back, Harold's forces started giving chase, which broke their formation, and then they were cut down by the Norman cavalry. And Harold was slain alongside quite a lot of men that day, and that basically was the end for the Anglo-Saxon rule. Following his victory at the Battle of Hastings, William, the Duke of Normandy, now was also the King of England. There were several rebellions with the aim of retaking the throne, but these were all unsuccessful and suppressed by William. And this is when the Norman Age began. Thank you for listening, if you're still here, that is. And see you in the next videos where we will be talking about what we've talked in this video in more detail. So this was basically an introduction into the era, and we're going to talk more. We are going to rather discuss more specific details. For example, the story of the start of the Anglo-Saxon invasion and how it's probably wrong and whatnot. But until then, take care. See you. Stay tuned.